Okay, so good afternoon or morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on the role of carbon revenues in financing the climate transition. Um, Today, for the hour and a half we have with you, we'll try and talk about the role of carbon revenues, first with an introductory remarks by Marina Garcia Alonso, who is policy officer at the DG CLIMA. European Commission. Then a keynote by Joseph Pryor. Then a presentation of I4C's work by Diana Cardenas Monar. And then we will go to a panel discussion. We are lucky to have many very good panelists with us today. I will present them a bit later in the discussion. And this as I was mentioning, it's like a 15 minutes Q&A, and then we hope, if we don't overflow too much, to be done by 1 hour and a half from now. Maybe one word about the Institute for Climate Economics, who's convening this meeting. So the Institute is a Paris-based think tank providing independent policy analysis and research-based analysis on climate change mitigation and adaptation. We try and promote climate policies that are effective, efficient, and socially fair. And our experts engage with national and local governments, the European Union, international financial institution, and the civil society organizations. So this is a broad presentation of all our themes of work. Today we are dealing with the tax and carbon markets team, represented mainly by Diana and a bit by myself, working at the European and international level. A word on the European Climate Dialogues project, from which this webinar stems. So the EUCDs project aims to facilitate exchanges on climate policy options, expertise, and success stories between the EU and non-EU major economies. So here, there's 56 activities under the EUCDs overall projects. We're focusing here on one of them, which is carbon pricing, and specifically on this, the work stream that is discussed here is about enlarging and enhancing existing approaches and also support a switch towards a comprehensive perspective on the use of carbon pricing revenues as part of a wide view of implementing low carbon resilient pathways. So this is the third workshop of a series of three. The first one was held in September, the second one in October, with a lot of interviews with country practitioners. So Diana will be presenting that in depth. There's a final report coming soon, and the conclusions will be previewed a bit later. Maybe one word on housekeeping. So that's mainly for panelists. If you can keep your video on the whole time, but your mic on mute, that's perfect. You've normally heard or seen that the meeting is being recorded. We will be sharing the replay with all of you afterwards. And for the participants, feel free. Actually, we're very glad to answer questions or comments you may have by sending them through the Q&A icon. And if you want to reach out to Diana or myself, just feel free to do it. It's name.surname@i4c.org. And with that, I will give the floor to Marina. Marina, can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you well, Sebastian.
And we can hear you perfectly. So the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you, Sebastian. Good morning and good afternoon to you all, depending on where you are. Welcome to this webinar on carbon pricing revenues under the EU Climate Dialogues Initiative. Sebastian was just explaining, we have a very interesting program today, especially because of the presentation from the Institute for Climate Economics on the results of the research that they have carried out on the different use of revenues as part of the EU Climate Dialogues project. We think it has become a very comprehensive analysis of the various approaches to revenues that exist in different carbon pricing instruments around the world. And we're sure that it will become a very valuable overall tool for those that are considering how they use their revenues. We see this webinar not about a discussion on telling carbon markets how they should spend their revenues. There are more causes than there are revenues, and there is no one-size-fits-all solution for the use of revenues. But we think it's a very useful tool for those that are considering how they're going to use their revenue so that they can really maximize their input in a just transition, and ensuring also that there's social support for these tools that are key. As the participants might know from the EU side, we are a fan of carbon pricing. We believe that putting a price on emissions really works to incentivize emitters to reduce emissions, and that this is not just a theory, but it is confirmed really on a daily basis. For instance, we see daily examples of coal power plants that are being replaced by gas or renewables, and investments in new low carbon technologies. And beyond that, we really see also the data confirming the transition. You might have seen in news last week that in the EU ETS, sectors reduced emissions by 15.5% in 2023 compared to 2022. This was driven mostly by the power sector, but also by efficiency improvements in industry. And this is an astonishing figure. In the years to come, we will see more efforts in industry, and here revenues will play an even more crucial role in supporting the decarbonization, as the lower hanging fruit are less available for grabs, and emission reductions need to happen increasingly in the hardest to abate emissions. The role of revenues is all the more important. From the side of the EU, there is a specific instrument for industrial decarbonization, the Innovation Fund, with a potential size of 40 billion euro between 2020 and 2030, depending on the carbon price. But revenues do flow directly to member states, and they can also use them in the industrial decarbonization. So it's an important role that we see. And we see also the tool as good inspiration for these new challenges that appear. At the same time as prices rise, there's also an increased attention for the social use of revenues. And this we see will only increase from the EU side with the new EU ETS for buildings and road transport. Citizens will feel the carbon price if they're driving a combustion engine car and if they're heating their homes. So it will be important to think about the targeted support of the use of revenues. From the side of the EU, we also have the Social Climate Fund that is partly financed by EU ETS revenues for this purpose. So in general, we see the research that will be presented today as a very important tool to face all of the new challenges for the use of revenues and really maximize the input. Finally, from the EU's perspective, we do note that the Commission has a limited power and it's member states that receive the greatest share of revenues. And it's important that we do improve in the data that we get from how revenues are actually used. So the reporting needs to improve, and also the visibility that is provided for those revenues. We do expect improvements as we have had recent changes in legislation, and there are new obligations to spend 100% of the revenues on climate purposes that are determined in the EU ETS directive. So with this, there's even further space to use such tools for improvement. So with this, I think we have a packed hour and a half ahead of us. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion to see how we can really make revenues work for the benefit of the climate, and by extension, to make the carbon pricing systems a success. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Marina. I guess that's very important context point to put forward, and happy to hear about the improving reporting thing. That is definitely a great addition, and this work is paving some steps for it. But that would be a very nice thing to work on in the future. Joe, over to you maybe for the keynote on the context of carbon prices worldwide.
Yes, thanks, Sebastian. And I think you have some slides that would be useful to talk through. Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to present today and be part of this, and the great work that the Institute for Climate Economics has done here and also in the past. And on this, we're very grateful for the collaborations we've had in the past between the World Bank and the Institute for Climate Economics, and look forward to further collaborations, not just on carbon pricing revenue, but beyond as well. So today I'll give an overview presentation of the state and trends of carbon pricing and set a bit of context for the discussion today. A lot of what I'm talking about today comes from our report that was released last year. Now, we're about to release an update on the 21st of May this year, so I encourage people to go out and have a look at that as well. So this is a useful map that shows the state of play for ETSs and carbon taxes globally. And this map has become a regular feature of the State and Trends of Carbon Pricing report. And we see that around a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions were covered by a tax or an ETS. Now, one of the biggest observations that we had last year was that despite a challenging economic environment, particularly in terms of energy prices, we saw not only carbon prices being retained, but new carbon taxes and ETS being come online, and particularly including in Indonesia and Australia as well during 2023. And in stark contrast, I guess, to previous challenging economic situations, the retention of those prices, there's a few observations from that. One is that carbon pricing is increasingly becoming mainstreamed, and policymakers are looking for other ways of providing relief rather than repealing or reducing carbon prices. So, Sebastian, if we could go to the next slide, please. So looking a bit more at prices, and this is an updated chart from ICAP's Allowance Price Explorer that shows prices extending into 2023 as well. And you can see that prices were varied across various jurisdictions, and this is just select ETSs. Now, there are overall macroeconomic impacts that will affect these jurisdictions differently, but there's also internal policy decisions that are affecting prices in terms of the scarcity of allowances and what drives those prices. But generally, we've seen upward trends across the majority of ETSs as well as carbon taxes, but variation across these. So if we go to the next slide, we can see a snapshot of carbon prices across all 73 jurisdictions with carbon prices. And I'd like to highlight three things on this slide. The first is the significant variation in prices across all the jurisdictions, from very high to very low. The second thing is the equally varying or differences across the levels of coverage as displayed by the intensity of the color. So the darker the color means that the higher proportion of emissions within the economy that are covered by or where the carbon price is applied. And so you can see there's a lot of variation across jurisdictions in terms of coverage. Now, the third thing I wanted to highlight is this grey band across the middle of the chart. And this is we call it the carbon pricing corridor, but it is the price that was recommended by the High-Level Commission on Carbon Pricing back in 2017 on the price level that is required to achieve the Paris Agreement goals, actually a 2-degree temperature target. Now, what you can see is that the majority of prices are below that recommended level, and in fact, less than 5% of global greenhouse gas emissions are covered by a carbon price at or above that level. Now, so what this essentially says is that carbon prices, there needs to be greater ambition displayed both in just the breadth of coverage, but also in the pricing levels to achieve Paris Agreement goals. So if we go to the next slide, please. And this is the last slide and a good segue into the rest of the discussion today on carbon pricing revenue. And this is really a useful chart to show how much carbon pricing revenue has grown over the last decade or so, highlighting, for example, that carbon pricing is increasingly being viewed as an important fiscal tool. Governments are looking at environmental fiscal reforms to collect revenue via environmental pricing, including carbon prices, as a more efficient and effective way, and less distortionary than traditional taxes such as labour and capital taxes. Now, one thing that we've seen is that over the last couple of years, for the first time, revenue from emissions trading systems, that is through the selling of allowances via auction, now accounts for a larger proportion of global carbon pricing, direct carbon pricing revenue than carbon taxes. Now, this is largely driven by the fact that ETS allowance prices are increasing faster than those of carbon taxes, but also increasing coverage of emissions trading systems. So with that, I'll pause there, Sebastian, and hand it back to continue today's session.
Thanks a lot, Joe. That was very exhaustive for a 5 minutes tour. I will hand over to Diana the screen sharing for her own presentation on the work she's been supporting for now more than nearly a year, actually. Diana, I'm stopping my screen sharing and over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Sebastian. Give me just 1 second to get to my screen sharing. Just let me know when you can see it.
We can see it, just not in, yeah, we can see the presenter's mode now.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you, Joe, and thank you everyone, Marina, also for being here and for joining us in this session. Just sorry, going back. I'm not sure what happened there. Sorry. Really not sure what happened there. Okay. Well, finally back to the presentation. Well, thank you very much. So as mentioned by my colleague Sebastian, I'm going to tell you a bit about this work we have been carrying out for about a year now within the framework of the EU Climate Dialogues project. And so we have done several things on the way. We have had the workshops last year. We discussed with several jurisdictions on this topic. And the purpose was to come up so with a way to inform policymakers and practitioners on the lessons learned and ways forward on the use of carbon revenues with a comprehensive approach. And so just to clarify a few elements that are quite important for context. So on the scope, we focus on revenue generating carbon taxes and ETSs. So basically carbon pricing instruments, compliance carbon pricing instruments that directly put a price on greenhouse gas emissions to encourage the reduction, direct carbon taxes and ETSs. And the review of experiences that we carried out covers 30 carbon pricing instruments in 27 jurisdictions that together make 94% of global carbon revenues. The methodology we use, so a mix of desk and field research. We carried out a literature review and collected both qualitative and quantitative data. We had some structured interviews with stakeholders, such as practitioners in different jurisdictions, international institutions, academia, think tanks, and NGOs. And as I mentioned, we had the 2 online workshops with around 200 government officials and experts. And just going to the picture in 2022, which is the year that we took for the study. So we can see that out of 71 carbon pricing instruments in place that year, 59 generated revenues. And as you can see in the scheme that shows the relation with prices and coverage that were variables already mentioned in the intervention by Joe, we see the EU stands out. Actually, the European Union ETS generates around 44% of global carbon revenues. And the EU ETS plus 4 G7 countries generated about 75% of global carbon revenues that year. We can see the UK, Canada, Germany, and France also standing out in that chart. And so going back to what I mentioned in the beginning, so we wanted to look at the subject with a comprehensive perspective. And so for that, we went through a process going back and forth from literature review to the experiences we were discovering through the interviews and the workshops, and finally also connected with our experience on public finance, and ended up trying to see the whole cycle of decision-making that policymakers are confronted with when looking at this topic, and using as an inspiration, let's say, the IMF's Green Public Finance Management Framework. We came up with this analytical framework that you can see here on your screen. And it's basically a 4-step approach to the question that starts with the strategy. So defining the purpose, that would be the first question. What policy objectives are we pursuing with the use of revenues? Do we have one? Are we just going to use revenues to fill fiscal gaps and send them to the general budget? Or we have specific objectives? How is the decision-making going to take place? Are we going to have a legal commitment, so legal earmarking, or political commitment, soft earmarking? How are the participatory processes going to be carried out? Are there going to be any? The second step would be operationalizing that, defining how to do it, the institutional and administrative arrangements in place, channels for revenue allocation, also thinking about broader aspects such as stability and predictability mechanisms. The third step is implementation. So what in the budget cycle would be equivalent to budget execution. So using those revenues as planned, but considering key aspects as transparency. So how do we report that? And communication, that is very important because of its link to public support. And the final step would be evaluation. So assessing the outcomes of the process, of the decisions made on the way, and having ex post evaluations to see the impact, effectiveness, the link with acceptability, and also accountability mechanisms, including ex post audits and parliamentary oversight. So what we did is using this framework and looking at jurisdictions through all of these steps. We reviewed, as I mentioned, 30 carbon pricing instruments, so 16 carbon taxes and 4 ETSs that you can see here in the map, including the EU ETS, which is the bigger ones, but also smaller ones, so a mix of carbon taxes and emission trading systems. At the subnational level, we look at several experiences from very emblematic ones like British Columbia, that's actually here today with us in the panel, to more recent ones or smaller ones like the subnational carbon taxes in Mexico. And passing on to what we found. So for each of these steps, so on the strategy, we found quite a diversity on policy objectives, and that's understandable as this is a matter of context and priorities. When working on the analytical framework, we came up with this scheme that you can see here with the spheres that shows the different options that you can have when you will define a policy objectives for your carbon revenue use, whether you decide for it to be an environmental objective, an economic or social one, or a combination. And then this will have implications on who you're targeting, who are your beneficiaries, and ultimately whether you're trying to address issues of acceptability of carbon pricing or probably offset the impact of carbon pricing, or it's just a total different and context-specific objective that is linked to your development priorities, for instance. That could also be the case, and it's actually the case in some of the jurisdictions we reviewed. And so just to go to the scheme and to the specific findings, we found that 21 out of 30 carbon pricing instruments have defined policy objectives as legal or political commitments, which means they're either in the earmarking strong or earmarking soft. But also some jurisdictions are mixing both. So are mixing, having some part of revenues are just going to the general budget and another part that will have a specific purpose. 9 out of 14 ETSs have environmental objectives combined with economic aims, and 9 out of 16 carbon taxes included environmental, social, and economic aims. This means that in the cases of ETSs, we see a lot more focus on economic actors and more diversity on the side of carbon taxes. On the operationalization, so we see also a wide array of institutional and administrative arrangements. 23 out of 30 carbon pricing instruments are using public budgets to channel all or part of carbon revenues. So there's something to differentiate here. So this is looking at the general budget as a channel itself. And in the previous one, we're looking at jurisdictions that had no policy objectives in the gray area, just to clarify. And there are jurisdictions that have a policy objective, but are using the general budget as a channel. And this can be done in different ways, like in the case of Japan, that's through a special account or just merging really with other resources. And unless you have some sort of way of tracking revenues, like climate budget tagging, for instance, you can really see, how much could be potentially contributing to climate, for instance. Then we found also that 9 out of 16 carbon taxes channel carbon revenues solely through the general budget. There are also some ETSs that do. And then 10 out of 14 ETSs, use channels other than the general budget to facilitate carbon revenue use. And so just to show a bit the diversity of this number. So on the ETS side, we have, for example, special purpose funds used in different jurisdictions. We can see there clearly Germany, New Zealand, Quebec, South Korea, but there are others also on the side of mixed. For instance, we have the EU with the Innovation Modernization Fund. In RGGI, several states of the US are also using these channels. Then we also have, for example, in Switzerland, that they're using for transfers to citizens, the social security system. In Austria, we have the tax system being used as well. So there are really quite a diversity of channels that can be used for the purpose of channeling revenues. On implementation, so here, just a few points and some very important related to the role of transparency and communication. So the picture you can see here on the use of revenues is also a reflection of the availability of data. So we based our analysis on publicly available data, and so this is what we were able to come up with. In some cases, it is just the planned and not the executed, because that was a bit harder to get. And so considering that, we found that around 55% of carbon revenues, about 50 billion, were used for climate and nature. 32% were unspecified, meaning they were going to the general budget, and around 11% were transfers to citizens. Then specifically, so on the ETS side, around 72% of revenues were used for climate. Important to say in this case that out of that share, a big chunk is the EU ETS. Then most carbon tax revenues, so around 54% or 14 billion, had no specified uses, meaning they were going mostly to the general budget. And then in the chart that you can see below, we can see the different jurisdictions and how they were using their revenues. And we found that in 9 ETS and 6 carbon taxes, at least a share of revenues were used for climate and nature. But there are also several ones that use them for transfers to households. On the final step of evaluation, we found that there is a need to strengthen practices to assess effectiveness on the use of carbon revenues. We found a few jurisdictions have taken that step further to carry out ex post evaluation or have external oversight on carbon revenue use. Here you can see some of the ones that we found. There could be others that we have not mapped. Just highlighting 2 of them. So California with the annual report to the legislature on the use of proceeds. And then Canada, where the Parliamentary Budget Officer actually carried out a distributional analysis of the federal fuel charge with some interesting findings that were used in different ways in a political context that's quite complex at the moment also in regards to the carbon tax. But finding overall that households, most households in the country have received more in the tax revenues than they have actually paid for the carbon tax. And just one point that I would like to make in considering what we have found, and that connects a lot to what we push for from A4CE, which is for countries to move forward with financing plans for the transition. And so as we see, carbon revenues are already playing a key role in the financing of the climate transition, and the results that we just presented are a testimony of that. And so the framework that you can see on the screen is how we see different building blocks of these financing plans. So starting with the climate investment, so determining what our investment needs based on our climate strategies. Then the public policies that should be considered, and this is where carbon pricing enters. And we have the financing, and in the financing, we can also have carbon revenues, and then macroeconomic interactions that should also be considered. So we have 2 spots where we have to think also about carbon pricing and about carbon revenues. And about carbon revenues as one of the options to consider to bridge the climate investment gap. Although they're not yet often integrated in climate strategies, we did high-level keyword analysis of NDCs and LTSs, and we found that out of the 68 LTSs published last year, until the end of last year, 23 had some mention of the use of carbon revenues, while only 4 NDCs did. And so there are opportunities and key milestones of the UNFCCC process for carbon revenues to join this broader discussion. And for example, this is the case of the NCQG at COP29. Some countries have been using revenues also for international climate finance on the development country side, and the new NDCs coming up at COP30. And just some final messages here on the lessons learned and ways forward. So policymakers are confronted with a chain of decisions on the use of carbon revenues that will have consequences in terms of effectiveness and acceptability of carbon pricing. First, to define policy objective, it is a decision that should be based on country context or priorities. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. The second point would be that operationalizing carbon revenues requires assessing trade-offs between different options, and that governance structures and how we design these institutional administrative arrangements and coordination are key. The third point is that to ensure transparency and effective communication, it is essential to raise awareness and increase public support, as well as to face political backlashes. And the fourth, to evaluate the effectiveness of carbon revenue use and improve accountability, it is important to work more on this ex post evaluation and audits because they remain limited. Another key message would be that decisions on the use of revenues can maximize benefits of carbon pricing and help ensure public support, but the potential trade-off with effective decarbonization must be considered to ensure policy coherence. And finally, that the landscape of carbon revenues will certainly evolve in coming years. We have already mapped some changes ahead in jurisdictions and that are thinking of increasing their contribution to climate action. For example, that's the case of British Columbia, Japan, and the EU. I will leave it there. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A section, and also eager to listen to our panelists in the section coming up. Thank you, Sebastian. Over to you.
Thanks, Diana. If you could move one slide that we see the panel. So thanks a lot. I'm now welcoming the panelists all to switch on their camera. We have with us Amanda Engel, who's strategic advisor in the tax policy unit in the government of British Columbia. Juan Pedro Searle, who's head of climate change in the Ministry of Energy in Chile. Asia El-Wassem, who's acting head of the Tax and Environment Unit at the OECD, William Wills, who's technical director in the Brazil Climate Center, and Stefano Carradini, who's working at the Andre Young School of Policy Studies in Georgia State University. So we'll be going through 2 rounds of questions with all of you, trying to dive a bit deeper on 2 things that Diana pushed forward. The first one is the link between specific practices and acceptability. And the second one would be the role of carbon revenues in the wider picture of financing the transition. So maybe turning to Amanda first. Amanda, so British Columbia has a long and well-known experience with carbon taxation. So based on this vast experience, maybe 2 questions first. The first one is, do you think a link can be drawn between specific practices on carbon revenue use and acceptability? And do you want to expand on that? And the second one is, would you think of any phasing elements or key factors for countries starting with carbon revenue or carbon taxation? Over to you, Amanda.
Thanks so much, Sebastian. So yes, British Columbia began phasing in our carbon pricing system in 2008. We implemented North America's first broad-based carbon tax. The tax applies to the purchase and use of fossil fuels in BC and to anyone who purchases or uses those fuels unless a specific exemption applies. So when our previous government introduced the carbon tax, it was revenue neutral, meaning all revenue generated was returned to individuals and businesses through reductions to personal, corporate, and small business income tax rates. Revenue neutrality helped increase public acceptance of the new tax, and we reinforced it using legislation that required annual disclosure of how carbon revenues were returned to taxpayers. Although our carbon tax is no longer revenue neutral, the revenue neutral measures that were introduced by our previous government are still in place today. Alongside our initial announcement of the carbon tax, the government also announced the climate action credit. So to help offset the cost of carbon tax, lower income British Columbians received this annual tax credit of $100 per adult and $30 per child. And that was paid quarterly along with federal consumption tax rebates. The credit is now called the Climate Action Tax Credit, and it still exists today, although it's been significantly expanded. Now, although this doesn't directly relate to how carbon revenues are allocated, I do think it's important to highlight that BC has always used a phase-in approach when it comes to changing our carbon tax rate. In 2008, although our target rate was $30 per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, we began with a rate of just $10 per ton, and then we implemented planned increases of $5 per ton annually for 4 years until we reached that target rate. And this helped really mitigate the shock of the new tax, and it improved public acceptability in turn. Then jumping ahead to 2016, the Canadian government introduced a national carbon pricing benchmark system. Under this system, provinces and territories are required to meet the federal government's minimum carbon pricing stringency standards, or the federal government will impose its own federal system within that jurisdiction. So to comply with the federal benchmark, the BC government began implementing increases to our carbon tax in 2018. Once again, the rate was increased by $5 a ton annually until it reached this time $50 a ton in 2021. Now, when these rate increases were announced, BC also removed that requirement that the carbon tax be revenue neutral. Instead, revenues collected between $30 and $50 per ton were divided between new green policy initiatives, decarbonization support for emissions-intense industry, and carbon tax relief for low and moderate income households through that climate action tax credit. Notably, the support for industry was funded by carbon revenues paid by industry. And this was important to maintaining the public's policy confidence. And that is a practice we still maintain today, even though BC has now transitioned to an output-based pricing system for industry. In 2021, the federal government strengthened its benchmark. So all Canadian provinces and territories had to increase their carbon price by $15 per ton annually beginning in 2023 until we reach a target price of $170 per ton in 2030. BC is complying with these federal requirements, and we've pledged revenues generated from these recent rate increases to carbon tax relief to British Columbians through that climate action tax credit. And although we had hoped that expanding the credit alongside the tax would improve the public's acceptance of increased rates, recent polls do indicate that public support for carbon tax is declining, not just in BC, but more broadly in Canada. The leader of Canada's federal Conservative Party has embarked on an anti-carbon tax campaign across the country, including a series of, quote, Axe the Tax rallies held in BC earlier this month. The federal Conservatives opposed the planned carbon tax increases, not just in BC, but across the country, arguing that carbon tax exacerbates the affordability crisis. Nonetheless, the government of BC maintains that we will not eliminate the carbon tax, and this position is supported by Canadian economists who recently issued an open letter stating that, quote, carbon pricing is the least cost way to reduce emissions, drive green innovation, and support Canada's transition to a clean and prosperous economic future.
Thanks a lot, Amanda. That's very interesting to hear both about the successes and current difficulties of carbon pricing and how you deal with that. So that's a very interesting prospect. Maybe turning now to a bit newer jurisdiction in terms of carbon pricing, but also with a strong climate ambition. Juan Pedro, I'd like you to share a bit on Chile, whose carbon tax is now 4 years old, if I'm correct, and who has been innovative in linking the use of proceeds with international standards for offsets and foregoing part of the revenue for actual direct actions by industries locally. So maybe if you could share a bit on how this went, what was the challenges, expected benefits, what do you see coming up, and what were the discussions on the trade-off between foregoing these revenues and actually using them yourselves, both in terms of efficiency and also acceptability of the carbon taxation scheme? Thanks a lot.
Super. Thank you, Sebastian. Can you see my screen? I mean, me on the screen? Because I can't see myself.
Okay, we can see you perfectly and we hear you.
Excellent, excellent. So thank you for inviting me and thanks for the questions. Yeah, so just to put a bit of context, our tax comes is embedded in the tax reform. So it's not a standalone regulation. So and why I'm saying that is because sometimes it's difficult if you want to, I don't know, introduce a modification to the tax, is because the tax reform is being, subject to any further revision by different administrations. So that's why we have this offsetting system in place. So we saw an opportunity with, I would say, the second revision of the tax reform. So we managed to introduce this offsetting system, and at the same time to change the threshold of the tax. So having said that, I would say regardless of, and another interesting figure of this tax is that it's a tax on CO2 emissions, not on the carbon content of fuel. So I think it added a little bit of difficulty, but at the same time is preparing the country for, I don't know, if we decide ever for a transition to a more sophisticated system like a cap and trade, for instance, because companies and also some public sector entities are more are now accustomed to measure and report emissions. So, and it's also a tax on local pollutants. But I'm going to leave that aside and come back to your questions. So I would say regardless of recognizing these standards, these international standards in the system, I guess the main challenge for the regulator was when this system was being designed, was where we were going to have, credits available for the system to operate from the beginning. So I guess one of the decisions, and it's more, rather than a challenge, is more an opportunity to look at those standards and to recognize them under our regulation, because most of the current ongoing projects in Chile were and will continue to be certified either by the CDM, Vera, and gold standards. So there was a pool of projects, kind of, easy to put a hand on in terms of trying to promote, regulated entities to buy those credits, of course, because those were also backed by well-known methodologies, and the regulator thought that not to reinvent the wheel in terms of, create an own standard. I think it's an idea of this administration to create a domestic standard, but given that there are plenty of standards abroad, there wasn't. It didn't make any sense to do our own standard now. And as I said at the beginning, the main reason was we need credits. We need the system to prove that it's working, and of course it will be improved over time. So having said that, in terms of trade-off, of course, there will always be trade-off between an instrument that was known as or was defined as a revenue, raising instrument. It depends on who you talk to here in Chile. For some, it's revenue raising. For others, it's of course has an environmental aspect, which I really believe it has. And the offsetting system, what it's trying to do is precisely to get traction from those sectors that are not regulated by the tax to promote mitigation there. So I guess this figure of environmental probably benefit, it's more present than when the tax was designed years ago. If I don't know if you had a chance, Sebastian, to look at the launch of the first year of operation of the offsetting system that happened like 2 weeks ago. And yeah, only 8 projects were used by regulated entities in terms of buying the credits, and the amount was, I think, lower than expected in terms of credits. So the credits, if I'm not wrong, only compensated like less than 1% of average annual emissions of all these regulated entities. That could sound like maybe a little bit I don't know, like not good news, but at the same time, in terms of positive outcomes of these processes that we were able to put in place. I mean, the Ministry of the Environment, Finance, those are the main actors there. So the government, the government was able to put in place the system. It's working, it's running, and from my personal point of view, we need to look at the price the rate, the tax rate, because it seems to be, or some people have the perception that it's really low, right? It's $5 per ton. It's a flat rate. There's no indication that this will increase in the future. So probably one of the reasons that there were so few projects available to buy the credit is because of the price. Probably maybe another figure that was also challenging to decide was the vintage year of those credits, because all of these projects, as I said, are ongoing projects, not new projects. So the vintage year is only from 2020 onwards. So you expect that to have very low volume of credits, because we didn't decide on a vintage more close to when the CDM was up and running really well here in Chile and in other countries. But that's the situation. And in terms of the trade-off, I would say that the Ministry of Finance was pretty conscious about that. And the aim of the tax in the end is also for those regulated entities to pay less tax, right? I mean, to pay less throughout the years, because we are reaching the environmental goal. But if we don't increase the tax rate, that would be pretty difficult to move the needle a little bit and to change behavior of the main regulated entities.
Thanks a lot. So we can all wish now that you go from $5 to $40 a ton and join Joe's corridor in the next years.
Well,
the credits fair then.
That's the aim. I mean, it's in some policy instrument. The aim is to increase it to 35 by 2030, and to be in a position to increase it even up to 80 somewhere between 2030 and 2040. But for that to happen, of course, I mean, revenue recycling will be key.
Great, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for this very interesting feedback, even though, this is an experiment in the making. Maybe turning now to Asia, the OECD has a broad experience with carbon taxation that goes actually quite beyond explicit carbon pricing, since you work a lot on the effective carbon rates report. We would be interested to get your take on the key trends in the medium term for carbon revenue use, what you are foreseeing from your statistics gathering perspective, and also what's your take on the second question Diana raised on the role of carbon revenues in financing the transition. Over to you, Asia.
Thanks a lot, Sebastian, Diana, for the opportunity to participate in the panel, first of all, and very excited and congratulations for a very good and solid report that's going to inform all of our work. So much appreciated. So, what we can anticipate on the carbon pricing front and its associated revenues is a bit, I mean, we see there are trends emerging. I mean, there has been already in our work we've seen, and also what Joe has showed us is that there is indeed a strong momentum towards increasing carbon pricing efforts, especially with a lot of emissions trading systems propping up across the world, and so. Sorry, and so this means that the, the trends in carbon pricing and the revenues are going to be driven by the type of instrument that is going to be put in place and how it's designed. As we've seen, revenue use and is not the same across the different instruments and different jurisdictions. So, to the extent that it's going to be more an ETS driven, the developments, across the board, then I think this will have implications on how revenues are going to be used. But at the same time, I think we also need to look more broadly at the current, geopolitical and macroeconomic context where there are structural trends like aging that will put additional pressures on government revenues. And so to the extent that, environmental fiscal reform, including carbon pricing, can fit into the picture, I think we may see more and more of a role in that. And I think Joe already pointed to this, the opportunity to use environmental taxes to reduce the distortionary taxes while raising revenue. But of course, over the medium term, depending on the pace of decarbonization, the point of environmental taxes is that they will erode the base eventually. And the pace of decarbonization is going to be different across different fuels and sectors, right? I mean, we would anticipate maybe for some countries, the transport sector may become more electrified, and this may have some implications on their revenue capacity, including on their capacity to raise revenues from fuel excise taxes, which in OECD terms, in our OECD view, we look at carbon pricing, including fuel excise taxes, as they place a price on a base that is proportional to emissions. So what I'm trying to say is that so it depends on the type of instrument, where, and also the pace of decarbonization in different sectors. And therefore, we anticipate that there will be a need for other instruments to stabilize revenues for countries that are going to be very important, both for the transition, but also for other purposes. We also see geopolitically that there is a convergence, or at least in advanced economies, a convergence towards more subsidy-based mitigation approaches, which come at a cost, of course. And this is both in jurisdictions with and without carbon prices. So we could probably see that, carbon pricing instrument revenues could be used to finance these subsidies. But I think it would be maybe too, how would I say it? I'm not sure that it would be sensible to count on carbon pricing revenues entirely to finance the transition, including the just transition. I think we need to look at the whole tax system and revenue generation capacity of the whole tax system that could allow us to not only finance green investments, but also social protection programs that would be needed for a just transition. So in our work, we're actually currently working on an interesting project on the distributional impact of carbon pricing. And this really shows to what extent we need to really understand the income distribution and the distribution of other characteristics that drive the consumption of households, both on fuels, but also on goods that also imply emissions in their production processes. So we need to look at the carbon intensity of consumption, and because this is going to impact to what extent households are going to be hurt by increases in carbon pricing. And so we see that the distribution of burdens from additional carbon pricing is very different depending on whether you're a rich or a middle income economy, for instance. And for instance, just taking the example of motor fuel. So in countries that are middle income countries, the increase in carbon pricing hurts more higher income households than low income households, because low income households tend to spend very little on motor fuels, whereas it's the richer households that drive cars, and so cars are a luxury item essentially in these countries. And just by understanding these differences across countries, across sectors, across fuels, can allow us to better target and increase the cost effectiveness of revenue recycling for social protection, for instance. Similarly, if we're looking at using carbon pricing revenues to finance investments, then it's very important to figure out to what extent you can use the tax system or subsidies in general to scale up investment. And this really requires understanding, again, the distributional impacts, but also how to design it so that you induce additional investment and you don't give windfall profits to firms that would have taken these investments anyway, right? So all of these considerations are very important to make sure that we are fully leveraging the power of carbon pricing revenues. But I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Asia. That was really enlightening, a broadening of the approach, and that was spot on the how to embed it in a global strategy to get this look of the whole tax system and its impact on social aspects of the transition. So maybe turning now to William. William, so Brazil is now in the process of developing its ETS, and I've seen that the Brazilian Center for Climate recently pushed a proposition for the design of the Brazilian carbon taxation scheme. So do you want to share a bit with us how the acceptability issue and the social aspect issue has shaped or influenced the discussion on carbon revenues in Brazil, and how should or will the phasing for carbon revenues look like in Brazil? Maybe over to you.
Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here discussing this issue. Yes, we recently proposed this for the Minister of Economy, the use of part of the revenues, at least part of the revenues, 5 to 10%, what we proposed, to recompose the power of purchase of extreme poverty and poverty classes in Brazil. As you know, we are a middle income, highly unequal country, and we have to pay attention to those classes that will suffer more during transition, right? But this was based on strong modeling. This was not just advocacy. You know, I was the executive coordinator of the modeling component of the PMR project here in Brazil, and we test different carbon recycling schemes, different different recycling schemes, 7 carbon pricing scenarios to check what would be the most effective for Brazil to reach its NDC, with a CG model constructed for Brazil, linked with sectoral models, so it was a complex modeling exercise, 2 years work. We had large stakeholders involvement. During the process, the results were accepted by society, by different stakeholders. And so I followed very closely what happened in Brazil, from the PMR recommendations to the carbon market bill that is in the Congress right now. The first versions of the bill in the Congress didn't establish the use of carbon revenues, which was okay. This could be defined later. But suddenly a new version emerged last year with very specific allocation, and 85% of the carbon revenues going back to industry for research and development. This is important also, right? This is important to, but it's investments, right? You could have a good return on investment or a bad return on the investment. But what we know for sure is that there is an increased cost for industry, so increased prices of products, and the poor income classes will for sure have their power of purchase reduced. So for a just transition, for a more, let's say, yes, easy transition, we need to recompose the power of purchase of those classes in Brazil. Well, going to the characteristics that we think that the carbon revenues should have. First, as you said, we should define the policy objectives, and they should be inclusive, right? We should consider political, fiscal, social, and environmental factors. And this should align with broader carbon pricing policies and national climate strategies. And Brazil is very particular because of deforestation, because of it is highly unequal. So we probably will have a different solution than other countries in the world, right? Also, effective and transparent communication is crucial. This is not the case of the bill that is in the Congress right now. And policymakers should also emphasize how the revenues will be used, should be used, are being used to deliver social and environmental benefits. And with that, increase public support, because I'll talk a bit more about that in the next question. But this trade-off between social and decarbonization is not a well-behaved function. It's a well-behaved function until a certain point, and then you can get discontinuity in the function and have chaos, like what happened, for example, in France during the Yellow Vest protests, or here in Brazil, we had a truck strike for 1 week and the country stopped because almost all our load transport is being made by roads. So discontinuity scenarios should be considered, and we should stay far from this part of the function. So this is what based our proposition to the minister this week. Thank you. I think my time is over. I will continue after.
So, Robert, that was great, and that leaves a difficult task for Stefano to wrap up the first round of questions. So maybe by reflecting a bit on what key factors you see to communicate on carbon revenues, William just mentioned how crucial it is and how wrong it could go in some cases. And also maybe key factors to increase public support apart from these communication issues. Over to you.
Yeah, all right. Well, thanks for having me. This is great. This is a good question, and maybe I'll take a step back first. I've been following the state and trends of carbon pricing reports for a decade or so at this point, and I find it very encouraging to see that carbon pricing has been expanding across many jurisdictions, and also increasing, that price levels that have also been increasing over time. It's not something that we could see on the snapshot that was showed today, but maybe there's a way, in future reports, you also have some arrows showing that the prices are increasing. We tend to think about, some prices being too low, but I think there is a benefit in having countries setting up the technical capabilities, and then you can start increasing from there. So sometimes people ask me, where do they see the future going. And I see carbon pricing as being, the next seatbelt that everybody would have, or maybe mandatory helmet wearing on, motorcycles, because, many U.S. states don't have that. So that's a scenario that we may still have in the future concerning carbon pricing as well. So I see that analogy, and this is where thinking about effective carbon pricing is very important. The OECD is doing a great work there. And so in terms of international coordination, thinking about some jurisdictions where carbon pricing may not be coming immediately, but you don't want to leave those jurisdictions out from international coordination. But it's great to see that many emerging economies are now adopting carbon prices. And I think the state and trends of carbon pricing reports could also include those additional bandwidths. I like the proposal of the International Monetary Fund for a minimum global carbon price that varies by income levels. And so I think that could provide some guidelines for where emerging economies could be and other economies may need to be as well. So to me, the price level is key. I understand this conversation is about the use of revenues, but my first point would be to say, and this is also related to a paper that I have in Nature, since 2019, that it's easier to find coordination on the price level than on the use of revenues. Diana was also mentioning that, the use of revenues is, including in the EU, something that could be more of a member state's decision. And she was also highlighting that there may be no one size fits all solution. So I think it's really crucial that we think about the price level first and foremost. Then, of course, the use of revenues matters. And there, I would like maybe to push back a little on this idea that I think Diana put forward, that there may be a trade-off in the sense that in not using revenues for earmarking, where you may be slowing down the carbonization. I would like to flip the script on that, because I think what could happen is that if you use revenues, if you earmark the totality of revenues, you may get to the point, that discontinuity that Will was mentioning correctly before, where at some point you start having protests, and then you may get to the point where your system is frozen at a lower price than what you could have had with a revenue neutral solution. So I think that's something that we should have clear in mind. I was working on these questions since before the Yellow Vest movement, and it was very predictable just by seeing the design that France decided to go for, that something would have happened in France. The tax escalator was already pretty steep under François Hollande. It was made even steeper under Emmanuel Macron. So there was no real surprise for people who were following these questions already then. We should say that the Yellow Vest movement got maybe too much attention in a way, because France still has a pretty high carbon price, and the Yellow Vest movement was not necessarily against carbon taxes or climate policy in itself. It was more about a question of design and purchasing power being hit. So I think we want to keep in mind that aspect, and also the old Tim Bergen rule that tells us that carbon pricing is an instrument designed to tackle a climate externality. So carbon pricing can be successful regardless of how revenues are used. When you think about revenues, then this is where public support comes in. And I understand that carbon pricing can be regressive in developed economies, but it's also very easy to make it progressive. And Diana mentioned, for instance, the case of Canada, the federal carbon tax of Canada, where revenues are given back lump sum to people, and that's a progressive reform. It actually makes most Canadian citizens financially better off. So under perfect information, Canadians should support this policy, or if the median voter would not be supporting this policy, that median voter should have a strong willingness to pay against climate action. They would be willing to lose money to stop climate action, and I don't see that being very plausible. So I think it's key that we communicate, and this is where your question comes in. We communicate well how carbon pricing works on the effectiveness side. First, that you can reduce revenues even without environmental earmarking. The general public often asks for environmental earmarking because they think that's the only way you can have an impact on emissions, because they miss the incentive effect, or the think about price elasticity of demand in the short run versus the long run. If you're like, oh, you anyway need to drive to work and we need to, use gas. So I feel this is not a Pigouvian tax. This is the government trying to raise new revenues disguised as an environmental tax. So I want them to tie their hands and use revenues for environmental purposes. But if you can communicate to the general public that carbon taxes can reduce greenhouse gas emissions, even if revenues are not earmarked for environmental purposes, that opens up a whole host of different options, including, for instance, carbon dividends, so lump sum redistribution as Canada does. But there too, you need to communicate to the general public, this is progressive. This can address vertical inequality. And the way Canada did it, you can address horizontal inequalities as well to some extent, because in the Canadian case, revenues are pooled at the province level and redistributed lump sum within a given province, so that there is no subsidization that, for instance, Alberta or some provinces that may be more carbon emitting would subsidize more urban areas. So I think these are some points that I would definitely highlight. Where we think about the trade-off, to me, is really in the ability of being able to gradually, and I would stress the word gradually, like we also heard from Amanda about British Columbia, gradually increasing carbon prices without getting even close to that point that Will mentioned about the discontinuity where you clearly reach protests. I've been working also on fossil fuel subsidies. They were not part of the conversation today, but that's also a case where even if fossil fuel subsidy reform may be progressive because of the reasons that, as I mentioned, you're still hitting the purchasing power of low-income households. And there are many examples of protests following those type of reforms. So I've been advocating for cash for subsidy reforms. That's something that we're trying to implement in Ghana as part of randomized controlled trials. I strongly believe that being able to ramp up prices slowly has the biggest benefit, also in terms of international coordination, because then you can try to push other countries to keep up with you. So these are my points. The last comment that I would have is about carbon tariffs. We haven't talked about carbon tariffs. I understand these may be beyond these, the scope of this panel, but at some point it will be necessary to think about them too. And there are options. There are discussions about redistributing revenues. We're talking about a massive amount of money that carbon pricing is going to generate in its different forms. And there are conversations, for instance, about giving money back from carbon tariffs to the countries of origin. And I would just suggest that we start thinking about international carbon dividends. This is something that I introduced also in that Nature paper, the idea that you could have revenues from carbon tariffs or harmonized carbon or a system of carbon pricing schemes that is coordinated across countries that are given back to citizens of the world in a lump sum way that would address within country inequalities, between country inequalities, and poverty to a large extent too. So this is something for the future. But I think this conversation here, I feel the next step, and as academics, we need to think not only about today, which is what people in policy needs to spend most of the time on, but also about what's going on in 10 years from now. And these are some questions that I think will emerge. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. That was actually a very good wrap-up of the first round. So many topics I would like to delve into. I used to think of carbon prices as the safety net of climate policies. So the safety belt is a quite close interpretation to that. And on the break lines, yeah, I couldn't agree more. And the revenue use discussion is very difficult, but actually that's key to, the price discussion is way easier, but unlocking the ambition and the price go through the revenue discussion. So yeah, definitely at some point it has to be held. And on the yellow vest, yeah, I guess a lot of people saw that coming. That was the worst tax design ever. So yeah, we could talk about it for hours. Maybe moving on to the last round of question in the interest of time. We have like 10 minutes left, so I'll ask you all to be very brief on the second one. I'm sorry about this constrained exercise. I guess the first round was very interesting, so I didn't want to interrupt anyone, but I will need to in the second one for everyone to leave on time. So Amanda, over to you again. Maybe prioritizing a question about what factors you think policymakers should consider when designing a carbon revenue use. We had some elements, but we didn't have your take on that because it came from other speakers. So if you want to add a bit on that, that would be great.
Sure, thank you. So our primary objective with BC's carbon tax and our output-based pricing system is to reduce emissions across the economy. But in doing so, we also want to make sure we are encouraging sustainable economic activity and encouraging industry to invest in low carbon technology and innovation. Carbon pricing is just one component of our broader climate change mitigation strategy, which we call our Clean BC plan. And that is our plan to lower British Columbia's climate changing emissions by 40% by 2030, while also creating more jobs and economic opportunities for people, businesses, and communities in a cleaner economy. Broadly, we have three objectives in our plan: reduce climate pollution, promote energy efficiency, and make BC a destination for low carbon innovation, investment, and industry. So you'll really see that our carbon pricing systems and our broader climate goals share common policy objectives, namely reduce GHG emissions while also encouraging environmentally sustainable economic activity and innovation. This pattern can also be identified in how we choose to allocate our carbon revenues. So for example, we use a portion of our carbon tax revenues to fund new green policy initiatives under that Clean BC plan. Many of these initiatives focus on clean economy and energy efficiency. And then every year we publish updated information on the programs we fund through our climate change accountability report, which I would encourage anyone interested in learning more to review. On the industrial side, a portion of carbon revenues paid by industry under our new output-based pricing system are directed to the Clean BC Industry Fund, which supports development, trial, and deployment of projects that reduce carbon emissions from large industrial operations. So to summarize, BC really prioritized creating alignment across our emissions reductions framework when we defined our policy objectives for carbon revenue use. And we allocate our carbon revenues to measures that are demonstrably related to our Clean BC goals. But this is not our only consideration. We're also very aware of the financial impacts that paying carbon tax can have on households, and we prioritize using carbon revenues to mitigate those effects. So a large portion of carbon revenues are allocated to the BC Climate Action Tax Credit, and that's a quarterly rebate that helps offset the impact of carbon taxes paid by individuals and families. Ultimately, this is an affordability measure. BC has a strong focus on protecting affordability as we strengthen our carbon pricing framework. As I mentioned, we're increasing it in alignment with the federal benchmark, and for at least these past two budgets, we have used all of our new revenues to enhance that climate action tax credit to protect affordability. So to conclude, every jurisdiction is going to be different, but in BC, we prioritize economic, environmental, and social factors when determining how to allocate our carbon revenues. And our objectives include reducing emissions, promoting energy efficiency and green innovation, and protecting affordability for British Columbians. And these are goals that really extend beyond our use of carbon revenues, and they can be identified across our broader climate change mitigation strategy. So thank you. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks a lot. That was really clear. Turning to Juan Pedro now, maybe with a similar question. So Chile recently published its financing strategy for finance mobilization in climate action. Maybe a word to understand a bit what is the role of carbon revenues in that, and how it articulates with other instruments that have been put forward in this strategy.
Yeah, I'll try to be brief because of the time left. In our climate financing strategy, there's no mentioning about carbon revenues and the use of it. So I think that we should have that issue on the table. Currently on our tax, the revenues go to the general budget, and that's it. But I guess in future discussions, we need to improve, for instance, the tax in that sense, in terms of maybe direct a little bit more the revenues to the purposes of to the environmental side of the tax. That's the intention. And we're gonna, this is like a promotion of our future work in the Ministry of Energy. We're gonna design and pilot the cap and trade for the energy sector. And of course, revenue recycling will be part of that discussion. And but if we don't manage to put the system in place soon, I think that carbon revenue recycling is key. And you said at the beginning and in the presentation, we saw different ways of using carbon revenues for different purposes. But I want to come back and finalize by this stating something that, or stressing something that Asia said at the beginning. We can rely just on carbon revenues for the purpose of progressing in our climate transition. We need more, and of course, carbon revenues are a key part in the equation, but not the part. So we cannot stress that much these instruments and then blame them because we didn't, reach the goals. So yeah.
Thanks a lot, and that's definitely a useful reminder back to the seatbelt. I mean, if you have an accident, that's not because only of the. I mean, that's not only because of the seatbelt. There's a lot of things you can do to avoid that. So yeah. Thanks a lot for this perspective. So Asia, turning to you, maybe following up on your previous intervention, I guess that would be interesting to get some examples from countries that are linking maybe the use of the tax system in general to environmental goals or financing strategies as a whole. Since that is, I mean, a really relevant point you are pushing forward, and also about excise taxes. So maybe countries having started to think of their whole fiscal and budgetary system or shifting it towards their financing strategy.
Yeah, I think on this part, so to highlight some country examples, I think what we see is some progress made, like I said, having this whole tax system perspective. For instance, there is the example of Finland that did their homework in terms of looking at their tax expenditures. That may encourage the consumption and production of fossil fuels. And we see that, it's not only about carbon pricing as such, so placing a positive carbon price, but also figuring out how does your system as a whole align with your climate objectives. And Stefano had mentioned, fossil fuel subsidies, and in that discussion you have tax expenditures, and that could result in important revenue forgone already for governments that could be used to support the transition. So we know that I think a country like Finland stands at the forefront of this kind of exercise, where they look at their tax system as a whole to make sure that it aligns with the carbon with their climate objectives. But of course, I think when it comes to the issue of fossil fuel subsidies and tax expenditures, it's especially these are very hard to reform once they're in place. So we have to think very carefully when we're embarking on this more subsidy-based approach to mitigation that needs to be funded with carbon revenues, but not only because it can create a path dependence in the policy format, have further implications for fiscal pressures on government revenues. But I think I'll stop there for the sake of brevity.
Thanks a lot. That was definitely an interesting perspective. and thanks to bring Finland here, we couldn't have more speakers in this panel anyway. So maybe turning to William now with the same question of, I mean, you brought very interesting insights of what were the discussions and how they faced around the use of revenue. So did at some point come the issue of how to finance the transition, or does it happen in a very separate place in Brazil?
Well, I stopped my last answer saying that for a middle income, highly unequal country as Brazil, part of the revenues should be used for social uses to tackle the disparities. But economic issues and also decarbonization should also be considered, right? And those uses are not exclusive. They can and should be combined. And striking the right balance is the challenge right now. But it could be adjusted over time. But it's important that policymaker has this in mind, that this balance should be decided over time and should consider all those different aspects. So those funds should be allocated efficiently to maximize both public acceptability, socioeconomic development, climate impact, decarbonization, right? In the case of Brazil, the Research and Development Fund that is currently in the bill, 85% of the carbon revenues, could come with great solutions for decarbonization in the country, such a unique country that will demand many unique solutions. But as I said, shouldn't be the only use of revenues. This balance should be discussed and improved over time. So it's essential for each country to carefully plan the use of those revenues, taking into account all those principles. And this tailored approach for each country will contribute holistically to the country's sustainable development. And this topic will become more and more important over time as we've seen by the presentation of the World Bank. We have a broader adoption of carbon pricing mechanism on the world, higher carbon prices projected. So this topic will become more and more important over time. But and to conclude, the acceptability of the carbon pricing scheme and the effective use of carbon revenues are deeply interconnected, and they have a great potential to significantly influence the success of climate transition efforts, for the good and for the bad, right? So a transparent, inclusive approach to defining objectives, coupled with effective communication and strategic allocation of revenues, can enhance public support and ensure that carbon pricing become a cornerstone of a just and sustainable low development for each of the countries. It's not the silver bullet, but this is a key part of the transition.
Thanks a lot, William. So Stefano, here comes the last turn. So I'm giving you a wild card here with only one constraint, which is hard. It's to make it brief. So over to you.
All right. No, this is great. I don't have a lot to add, so maybe I just keep it even shorter than you thought. But I would just stress how important I think to me it is to be able to find this right balance that you are all highlighting. I think there is an urge to tackle climate change. We all understand that, and we all think that carbon pricing has a role to play. But I think we are in agreement in this panel that other policies are necessary. I think the experience of the Yellow Vest movement in France is such that we should think about what President Macron was trying to achieve there. The goal was to be a leader with a very high carbon price that backfired, and eventually France, that approach slowed down climate mitigation not only in France, but also elsewhere in the world, because people were looking at the Yellow Vest movement and say, oh, we should pause our carbon pricing efforts. How often I'm reviewing papers where people are saying, oh, carbon pricing is politically impossible or very hard to implement, even though there are 70 jurisdictions and there have been, pushbacks only in France. Australia, but Australia is back, Ontario, but Ontario is back. So, people sometimes tend to infer from outliers. So I would just conclude by saying that I hope that, all the countries that we, talked about today and more will be able to, strike that right balance, that we will not have another issue like the Yellow Vest movement in the future, because that could be contagious to other countries. We don't know where the discontinuity that Will was referring to is, so we want to keep some margin, and other policies can fill the gap. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Maybe reacting to this Yellow Vest thing, actually, I think that was a very great thing to happen in France, because it drove us away from carbon tax as the only climate tool in the policy toolbox. And now the climate transition plan is much better balanced. That's something we've put forward recently. And it does not only draw on carbon taxes, both for changing behaviors and for funding the transition. And yeah, I would make the case that this has been a great event. I don't know how strong I can make it, but we're working on that right now. Thanks a lot for all of that. I think this is coming to an end. I'm handing the floor to Marina for the closing words, but I would really like to thank all of our speakers and panelists. That has been brilliant. It's been really insightful and really complimentary, actually. So we will share with you the replay, but also the report. And now over to you, Marina, for the last words of this webinar.
Thanks, Sebastian, and thanks for giving me the last words. It's definitely hard to conclude on such an interesting event. So I'll start first by thanking I4C for the organization and for sharing the interesting findings. It's really a comprehensive research that is not easy to find elsewhere. Speaking from the EU's perspective, in regulating the EU ETS, it really provides a wealth of exploration. For example, it was very interesting to hear that a jurisdiction had analyzed their use of revenues and was able to prove that households received more money to pay out. Maybe we should do more of that research to have those strong figures or that data to share. Many thanks also to all of the other speakers. There's really many lessons to learn from others' experiences that can help us all reach that right balance that we have been speaking about in past interventions. Also, just to mention a few examples, Amanda's from British Columbia's revenue neutrality in the system as idea to phase in. I think it's an interesting one for future systems that could be applied. Of course, I think this is mentioned throughout. Each tool needs to be seen in the specific context. And for example, revenue neutrality is something that's challenging for the EU that doesn't have that much power in taxation, but still can bring good ideas in the same way as Brazil's example in re-earmarking part of the revenues for extreme poverty. We also have had recent changes in the EU ETS regulatory framework that have the explicit possibility to use revenues for climate dividends. So the discussion has also been very interesting, as it was mentioned throughout, although again with some specificities, because we do have some green conditionalities to be aware of. And I think just to close really from the beginning, I think it was mentioned throughout by Joseph, and then Asia also from the side of the OECD confirmed that carbon pricing has really grown over the last decade, and that despite the challenges. And with the higher prices and more carbon pricing instruments set up, there is a greater attention. And I would also like to add a bit of a greater pressure on the use of auction revenues. I think we have seen that more recently through on the side of on the EU ETS, the more revenues are generated, the more this is seen as a tool for financing. And all of a sudden, people have lots of ideas on what can be done with revenues. And that depends a bit on what is high on the political agenda. And I think that comes to highlight, again, the importance of the research that I4C has provided, because having that solid research can help put all of the requests for use of revenues for this and that, depending on the moment, into context, to have a solid basis to say, this is what we know is maybe, considering our specific context, but based on the experiences of others, a good way forward in our climate transition, and of course, ensuring the social acceptability of the pricing tool. So thanks to all for this work and the discussion. It was a really interesting webinar.
Thanks a lot, Marina, and thanks to all for participating. And yeah, thanks again to all the panelists and speakers. And yeah, I hope you learned a lot. Feel free to reach out to Diana and I, as I was mentioning at the beginning, and we'll definitely share with you the report shortly. Diana, I don't know if you want to add in a last word.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, everyone. Really super interesting discussion. We have lots of new ideas of things to look into for coming up work. So thank you for that, and happy to stay in touch with you all, because this is a topic that still has a long way to go. Have a great rest of the day, and thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.